China got the sweet deal domestically. High-end technocratic overlords, massive impoverished underclass. They don't have to outsource, they got the best of both domestically. Plus, authoritarian repressive regime and lots of state interference control over the economy, and no limited government/separation of powers. What a recipe. The problem is maybe they collapse though. Also central-local relations is way more complicated and more difficult for them than people think it is. And they're only able to act at the very top end because they're benefiting from technology from other places. They've got the capitalist IP specialization global economy shit baked right into the dough. That's why export controls are such a big deal for them. Yet, people who actually produce stuff out of there will risk censor crackdown. Like the translator for 3-Body Problem got into trouble with the censors. After the book won the Hugo Prize and all that, they got so much attention and so many Chinese authors reaching out to them. All dried up, censors had gone around all the Chinese publishing houses and told them not to do it because they didn't feel like they had enough control over this translator. Like not even that they had done anything wrong, just they were outside the bubble of control where the state felt comfortable. So you'll have this continued tension of the incredible talent and ambition and drive of Chinese people running up against the walls of their paranoid and authoritarian rulers. Some people hear this, tend to either think that this means the regime is going to collapse, or that productivity and creativity etc. are going to eventually get squeezed to nothing. I think these are both wrong. It's just not clear how it's going to go. And people are way too confident in each view and have been for a long time. Digital platforms are the best thing for underground scenes maybe ever. But the CCP is getting really good at policing them. It's a struggle and there's like a bunch of unknown unknowns. A fence-to-fence balance of various surveillance and counter-surveillance technologies, but that's where the action is. But really one of the big questions is how much will the state adapt? I think if you get a new generation of censors that are more tolerant of certain types of creative expression than just generally have a different theory of change about censorship, you could see a still repressive but much more naturally bottom-up state-aligned Chinese creative model, where people feel even less bothered by the censors, and are just more inclined to produce media that is in line with the wishes of the state. I think that's already happening. The question is how far can it go and what are the trade-offs there? And one of the big reasons I think people get confused is that there's just such a huge wall between the domestic Chinese experience, and to some degree the Chinese language experience even among the diaspora, and Western observers. People's assumptions are just completely wrong about what it's like on the other side of these divides. And that goes both ways. And this matters in tech too. And lots of other places. Also it's complicated. It's much more acceptable to criticize local officials and otherwise comment on events that directly affect you. If you start making sweeping criticisms of the regime itself or of Marxism-Leninism or start saying shit that's pro-Taiwan or pro-democracy or pro-Xinjiang or blah blah blah, that kind of shit no good. And then there's this in-between meta where the censors are trying to figure out like what they want to crack down on, what they don't. Good example is the fight over historical figures in video games. CCPA banned all new video games for like a year while they reshuffle some of their bureaucratic structure to figure out how they wanted to do censorship in the future. Keep in mind this is a billion-dollar industry. The way it works is all new media including video games has to be approved by the censors before it can be released to markets. And they just said they're not going to approve anything until they reshuffle some offices. When the new office started approving stuff, one of the things they cracked down on was the use of important figures from Chinese history and culture. The worry is that people would use these characters as metaphors to criticize the regime. Underneath the surface here is the worry that people can use online spaces with coded communications like that as a way to organize. Hong Kong protesters did a lot of stuff like this. Even money laundering. A lot of people try to get money out of China through video game currencies. Many of these people aren't activists in any way, they're just literally trying to get their money out because CCP has such tight control about how the RMB can leave the country. But mixed into that are groups that the CCP considers dissidents. Or if not dissidents, just ordinary criminals they don't want to tolerate. So like farm rare V-game items / accounts whatever. Sell them to Westerners, trade the foreign currency for the restricted Chinese currency. With various intermediary layers and brokers etc. Crypto obviously relevant. But this is harder to deal with in China than people assume too. Pretty difficult for ordinary people to make a lot of use of cryptocurrency in China. Hard to get your money out. Like Sexy Cyborg, people tried to support her after that Vice piece got her in trouble because it raised questions about her money and revealed the size of her Western audience and even created some censorship concerns. Anybody who gets a large enough audience that they become a public figure gets additional scrutiny from the censors, and the Vice piece effectively pushed her into that bracket. People tried to support her with crypto donations etc., but because her finances were now under so much scrutiny, she really couldn't make use of any of that, and in fact having those donations funneled to her put her at risk, creating the impression that he was somehow involved with a lot of foreign money. In this case that's mostly not true. But a spike in donations via cryptocurrencies or whatever based on the Vice article could give a bad impression and make her look very bad and put her literally in real danger. Because again this stuff is associated with a lot of criminal activity or dissident stuff that the CCP is really very serious about. So they're not just cracking down on her because they don't like her content or something, there's a concern that she's involved in something much broader and much more threatening to the regime.
I wonder if we can make a smuggling system using cam girls and a Chinese OnlyFans clone.
Yeah, this type of stuff exists. Lots of it. And Chinese authorities are increasingly trying to crack down. And these structures are used by dissidents and other groups the Chinese authorities feel are very dangerous, much more so than just regular old criminals. And some of the regular old criminals are still pretty bad and operating at a very large scale. So this is like an example of why the conversation about censorship in China and whatever is just really fucking terrible in the West, because none of these dynamics are accounted for and people just gloss over everything because there's a boogeyman authoritarian regime at the top. They are authoritarian and repressive, but the story of how that influences their behavior is much more nuanced and less arbitrary and ideological than people assume. As just one more example of, frankly, in my opinion, mostly white Westerners exoticizing other cultures, uncritically accepting simplistic characterizations of their behavior, and turning off brain. The CCP is repressive and paranoid, so any and everything they do that could possibly be explained by some really knee-jerk simple story like that is just sort of accepted pretty uncritically. Or people will just exoticize and say that it's Chinese culture without interrogating what that actually means. Like, why is cultural significance actually important? How's it actually interacting with the other dynamics that drive behavior by regime and others? And then they generally just tolerate a bunch of stupid racist shit. Good recent example is Steve Saleen. Long story, but effectively a Chinese-American wheeler-dealer used Saleen's prestigious but failing Western business to brand a scam in China that effectively defrauded the government of a lot of money. The Chinese authorities cracked down and are in fact considering nationalizing the new Chinese scam company. Steve Saleen in July wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that this was just another example of the Chinese stealing his intellectual property and nationalizing his company. This is basically bullshit. It's possible that his IP really was stolen, but if so, it's because of his Chinese-American con artist co-founder misleading him and everyone else. And he fucking knew something was up. The valuation of his company went up like over 100 times in the conversion to the Chinese market. Just not feasible. He knew his shit wasn't worth that much, and he was willing to go along with it as long as he was the one benefiting. And meanwhile, in China people are increasingly sensitive to Westerners doing shitty crap like this. There's a lot of them, though this is especially bad, frankly. And this also ties into nationalist narratives about their colonial past. The century of humiliation. Signs in Shanghai that prohibited dogs and Chinese from entering parks. Practices tied to segregation and the broader legacy of colonial racism in the US and across Europe. And this is a big reason why I think diversity and inclusion in the US domestic context is actually essential for foreign policy. Chinese Americans and other people who have familiarity with these cultures are less likely to be misled into knee-jerk stupid characterizations of events. Embrace of these values not only improves domestic stability and generally is just the right thing to do, it will improve American credibility. Cracking down on dumbasses like Steve Saleen makes it a lot harder to make the case that the US is just racist and biased against China. Domestically the censor and other things have influence on that, but it does matter. And it matters to the elite communities, which are often Western educated and have at least some experience with Western culture, so they do not accept the really simplistic propaganda line that the CCP might want to push to the general populace easily either. Anyway, yeah. This is part of why I harp so much on the diversity stuff. I support it for domestic reasons and I think it's misunderstood and I think it's just right, it's my values. But I think it goes a lot farther than that.
Chinese people just have a different threshold for the balance between order and freedom. I don't buy that this is just a CCP thing.
Seed of truth, but I think this type of starting point almost always leads to the wrong conclusions. I think a lot of the reason that Westerners are so into freedom is path dependency. Liberal democracies have been around for a few hundred years, people have gotten used to living under these types of governments and have tied their identity and shaped their values around those cultural narratives. I feel like that is at least as important to understanding the cultural gap between Westerners and Chinese than facts about Chinese society. And I think Westerners are far too willing to point to things like Confucianism or Imperial China and then just turn the brains off and stop thinking. If you live for a few hundred years under authoritarian regimes, you get used to it. Values and cultures are influenced by social structures. So like, even if there is a correct version of this, that's not the interpretation people's brains jump to when they hear this stuff. And figuring out how much this is actually true, like how much does this stuff actually contribute to Chinese people's opinions. This is also super complicated and indirect and just requires a lot of subject matter knowledge. So yet I think it's just the wrong way to frame things, even if it's debatably true in a narrow sense. And of course the reason you can't have that more nuanced debate is because far-right racist assholes are still around and fucking everything up constantly for everybody. Poisoning the well, so that if you try to add nuance to discussions on diversity and inclusion, especially if you're a white guy, you get lumped in with the far-right people. And since centrist liberal institutions are not responsive to domestic needs or you really in general responsive to diversity that's more than just Captain Planet tokenism, you get Leninists. Which I've ranted about before recently. And then they poisoned the conversation between diversity and inclusion people and centrist liberals who would eventually agree with them if they actually could figure out what the fuck was going on. And all of this is very emotional. People get really fucking worked up if they get called racist. People get really fucked up if they feel like they're being discriminated against based on their race. People who are traumatized, because of serious acts of violence often brought on by poverty or whatever, get especially worked up. Social ails which are fueled by discrimination make it more likely for trauma to occur. But also you have relatively privileged people who are still traumatized, and they get really worked up too. So over time everybody is just fucking like at their breaking point emotionally and ready to assume the worst about everybody else who doesn't agree with them. Dumbass far-right garbage sets things on fire. Leninists also set things on fire. Everybody's defensive and reactive and stressed, and it is just impossible to have any kind of reasonable conversation under these conditions. And defensive centrists are still in denial. What about charges for Breonna Taylor? What about regulatory capture by police unions? What about property debt structures that keep buildings empty because landlords will get fucked by the banks if they lower the rent? What about the gap between market performance and real-world economy? What about how shitty healthcare still is? What about the mandatory subscriber regulation that makes medicine way too expensive and exclusive and creates the need for insurance companies that are exploitative? What about pharma companies lobbying to keep obviously abusive and extortionary IP thickets in place on drug patents? And biosimilars like insulin? What about manufacturing and blue-collar jobs? What about opiate addiction? What about access to mental health, etc.? And what about racial discrimination in all of these things, which is increasingly backed by evidence, even when the standard was honestly set too high in a biased way in the first place? There's no guarantee right now that centrist institutions are going to respond to that, and there's strong evidence that they're still going to resist. So you have this really strong domestic stability reason for the reasonable centrist liberals to come to God on some of this stuff. Fix campaign finance, make the obvious reforms that you know you should have made and didn't because of lobbying. Clean up the international financial markets and end tax havens. Re-examine how mortgage-backed security structures limit the options of banks and landlords. And overall create crony capitalist fake free market dynamics. Sign on to the OECD Common Reporting Standard. Punish Delaware and South Dakota and other US tax havens. Crush the obvious tax havens like Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, Ireland, etc. Back-charge companies for the taxes they evaded. If they don't like it, blacklist them. Consider criminal charges against executives if they're warranted. I mean, personally, I think the government just needs to be consequentialist about everything. Turns out market dynamics are pretty good at a lot of things. When they're not, when something's not working, the government should fix it. How to fix it is a complicated issue. Whether or not the government should be allowed to act to fix it, is not. The higher level real debate is how you figure out when the government should intervene and when it shouldn't. But we're not allowed to have that conversation because half of the people are just religiously opposed to any kind of government intervention because of pretty stupid simplistic pro-market arguments. And the other half is religiously opposed to markets. In part because there are so many stupid arguments for them and they are often used in such a Denialist way. And once again you got the far right, who are actively malicious and are not even really disguising it very well. But the center doesn't see it that way for some reason.